Darker Pastures is a prairie gothic horror anthology and contains scenes and themes which some listeners may find distressing. For specific content warnings, please always be sure to check the episode notes and listen at your own discretion. Thank you for tuning in. I hope you enjoy today's humbly hideous offering. Beware those who justify their misdeeds with words such as strength, duty, honor, or natural order. And beware most of all those who see bloodshed and rapine as an act of divine communion, for of such men are the truest monsters made, both upon and beyond these darker pastures. Cultus, Latin, noun, masculine. 1. The act of tilling or cultivating. An act of nurture or protection. 2. The act of veneration. 3. A religious sect or organization. A cult. Episode 15. Cultus. The men gather upon the freshly tilled field as dusk deepens toward night. They number 12, teenagers, men, young and old, and middle-aged. Their dress is plain, faded work jeans and worn t-shirts and flannel button-ups. Only one among them wears finer clothes. Sleek new black jeans, and cowboy boots, and a pristine white western shirt. All of them also bear a weapon, pistols holstered on their belts, rifles strapped over their backs, shotguns resting on their shoulders. As the land turns to shadow beneath the fiery western sky, as the first stars begin to peep like wary eyes in the deep blue of the void overhead, the men form a circle. The finely dressed man moves toward the center and holds his AR-15 aloft with both hands as he intones, "From the sacred earth we draw nourishment, and for this we are bound to it, and it to us. We are bound," the circle echoes back. The man in the center begins to slowly perambulate the circle, his rifle still held above his head. As he speaks, he pumps it slightly in the air, up and down. The land is ours. Our fathers killed and bled for it. With the blood of our enemies, we nourish it. The circle repeats the last phrase. We nourish it. Now the man, as he walks, pauses before each of the others to look searchingly into their faces. His gray-eyed gaze is as piercing and frore as a January's north wind. We are fathers, he continues. We are sons. We are protectors. We are warriors, the wolves of God. We are men. We are men. We are men. We are men. As one, the men of the circle raise their voices in an awful mockery of howling wolves. Perhaps, if there were any neighbors near enough to hear them, they would intervene or place a call to the county sheriff's department in consternation. But the nearest house is a mile away and belongs to one of the men who now howls into the dark, the same man who owns the field on which they stand, and at his right bellows the chief deputy, his mouth turned leeringly toward the risen gibbous moon. Pastor Marvin leads the little non-denominational church at the edge of town in hymnal worship, smiles at the congregation as they finish singing and seat themselves. He gives a humble little sermon on the meaning of forgiveness, on the inherent divinity of something so fundamentally beyond human capacity, especially since no one can ever hope to be worthy of forgiveness. Afterward, he stands at the door and exchanges empty pleasantries with each of the congregants as they depart, smiles through the unseemly flirting of Lottie Harwich as best he can. He can sense the strain in his wife Ness beside him, though he knows that her smile will be more convincing, more genuine than his own. Marvin reminds himself that Lottie's tribulations are many. Only a year ago, her husband stopped coming to church, and Marvin was one of the last to learn why. He'd left her and skipped town with a high school girl he had impregnated, and somehow the shame of that seems only to be thrown at the feet of Lottie and of the 17-year-old child, never at the 43-year-old man who had used them both. When Marvin and Ness finally get home, he moves to the bedroom and strips down to boxers and undershirt, then lies face down into the fabric of the bed, deliciously cool after the August heat. Ness sits on the bed beside him, still wearing her Sunday dress. Her patience has always amazed him, far greater than his own. Sometimes he thinks that she should stand at the pulpit, and he smile lovingly from the pews as she speaks. He says, slowly, as though ripping the words up out of his insides, that he's lying to them all. It's insufficient as an explanation, and yet Ness seems to understand. Brushing his shoulder lightly with her fingertips, she says that he's too hard on himself, has always been. Marvin agrees, but the assent feels hollow. She tells him that he will find it again, like he always does, and once more he agrees, but inwardly he feels certain that this time is different. A rubber band can only be stretched so many times before it simply gives and breaks, and he knows that this is also true of minds and of souls. When, with more gentle words, his wife moves into another room, Marvin nourishes the pillow with his secret tears. The circle meets this time in the full light of day, in the building just off Main Street, where the local Rotary Club chapter holds its events. It is, in fact, as members of this other organization that they pose. One of their number owns the building, and no one will question it. As servers set the light lunch upon the white-clothed tables, they wait. At last, The youths arrive, the ones lured with promises of scholarships and bright futures. The man in the white western shirt rises and welcomes them with a smile lacking all warmth. One of the high school boys, and they are all boys, nudges his friend and murmurs that it looks like a total sausage fest in the room. The other boy chuckles. The finely dressed man clears his throat and leads the group in an invocation. Some of the scholarship seekers shift uncomfortably in their seats. It's a strange prayer, unlike any they have ever heard before, and they do not like being given no choice of participation, but they do not dare to interrupt, or protest, or even complain amongst themselves. Somehow, when they look upon the speaker, they know that he belongs there, more than they do, even though many were born in this town, had fathers and grandfathers born in the county. The prayer ends, but the man continues speaking, and slowly the expressions on the faces of the youths change, become an awful melange of awe, horror, and yearning. The following Sunday, it takes all Marvin has to get up in front of his congregation and project the sermon he has diligently, joylessly composed. He'd sought inspiration in all of the passages, all of the parables which had once filled him with devotion. He quotes from the Sermon on the Mount, speaks of mercy and forbearance and humility, and for a moment he almost believes again in that perfect love which had once seemed to radiate like light from the pages he pored over, to suffuse the air and the material of the world. When later he stands at the doors, exchanging the customary words and handshakes with the departing worshippers, Hal Nystrom approaches him, face red and furious, refusing to accept Marvin's proffered hand. Hal demands sputteringly where the hell such a soft, commie message came from. At first, Marvin is too stunned to reply, hardly even understands what Hal is asking. When he finally speaks, his voice quavering more than he likes, Marvin says that everything in his sermon came directly from Jesus' own words. Hal gnaws at his lower lip. Sure, he says slowly, spitting a little. Then he goes on to say that it's weak, and he doesn't want to hear it anymore. Marvin finds his nerve then, and says, a little harshly, that a person cannot both call themselves a believer and reject the word. That, he says, is as bad as not believing at all. Worse even, that it's bearing false witness. Hal's face flushes so dark that it seems almost purple, and he turns and walks away from the church. Just before he gets into his pickup, Hal turns and shouts across the parking lot that they will see who is more real. Marvin's weakling god, or Hal's god of blood and fury. Then he climbs in and roars out of the parking lot, forcing Rita and Chris Montalban to hastily pull their 6-year-old girl out of his way. Nystrom gives no sign that he hears the outraged shouts that follow him down the road. As Ness moves to check on the Montalbans, Marvin stares at the rising cloud of dust that obscures the retreating pickup truck. He doubts that Hal will ever return, and though it's contrary to his calling, Marvin is glad for that. But he cannot shake the feeling that he has unwittingly opened a door, one which he didn't know was there, and through which anything at all, might emerge. The circle has grown to 21. The overcast sky spits a fitful drizzle as they gather in the field, trampling the sprouting field peas. The man who planted them stands among their number, betraying not the slightest hint that he's annoyed by the disturbance of his crop. There is a 22nd soul among them, his hands crudely bound with electric fencing wire that cuts and constricts his wrists. He hasn't been in the county long, and speaks only a little English. His movements are marred by that subtle weakness that comes with mild starvation, and the stale body odors of one denied basic hygiene permeate his clothing. He looks around the circle with terrified eyes, and when they remove the stained blue and white handkerchief gag from his mouth, he can only summon the words of his first language, which they do not understand, and wouldn't heed if they could. The leader of the circle asks the others if this man belongs among them, and they deny it. Then he asks if they would let such a stranger lie with their wives, their daughters, and the circle roars abnegation. Dios mío, salve la vida de mi familia, the man says softly. One of the gathered men strikes him in the mouth, drawing blood. We are the wolves of God, the leader readies his AR. We are men. We are men. As fathers, we nourish the earth. Like lovers, we fill her and quicken her ripe womb. Blood is life. Blood is life. The circle unspools into a slightly curved line. The bound man is pushed roughly forward, and sobbing he begins to run. 21 thunderous voices split the night. 21 tongues of flame lick the air. And the ruined father falls to the earth, weeping redly. As he sits over the remains of the evening meal, Marvin says baldly that he cannot go back. Ness tries to reassure him, but he cuts her off, saying that his faith is gone, not just wavering, but well and truly gone. Silence holds mastery for a minute, 2. Finally, Ness reaches across the table and gently cups his hand in hers, saying that maybe it's time for him to talk to someone. He's been trying to carry it on his own, she says, and it's too heavy, that there's no shame in seeking help. Marvin makes no reply, only stares down at the chicken bones on his plate. Inside, he feels like he's tumbling through an infinite sea of black smoke. A little while later, Ness rises and clears the table, washes up, asks him if he's coming to bed. Vacuously, he stands and follows her to the bedroom, lacking the volition to do anything other than what is suggested. Long after she's fallen asleep, chest rising and falling in the soft rhythm of restorative repose, Marvin lies awake, wide-eyed in the dark. Nystrom's last utterance keeps reverberating in his skull, mocking and utterly vile. And yet, Marvin thinks, there is a certain seduction there, in the rage and the cruel certainty behind the words. No, he corrects himself, not certainty. A callous unconcern with truth, with morality. Yes, he admits reluctantly to himself, he envies that. The field peas are growing tall when they lead the two young men out into the field. The youths were among them, briefly, before they saw the taking of life and lost their stomach for membership, before they truly understood what they had chosen to become a part of. Unfortunately for them, when they had chosen to go to the sheriff's department, it was one of the circle that had met them at the door. Halfway to the place of letting, one of the boys begins to weep, to plead, appealing to their mercy. Mercy is for sissies, one of the men says. The boy collapses then, and they drag him the rest of the way. The other boy cries too, but silently. His gaze does not shift from his feet, and he marches hopelessly toward the place of their shared doom. Something has begun to take shape there, growing beneath a thin blanket of earth, and bulging through ambiguously in patches. From what they can see of it, it is pale, and a smell rises from it, of iron, of toxic smoke, of death. It shifts under the soil as they approach, groaning with anticipation. The men behind them do not acknowledge the thing, seem not to notice its presence at all, even when the sobbing boy points shakily and utters a fragment of a question before his voice breaks. As they drag him closer, he begins to scream, continues even as the ringing shots tear and rupture his flesh, splinter his bones. The other boy falls on top of him, a tear rolling down from his wide, skyward staring eye. The thing below them howls in ravenous delight. Sitting at the grimy counter, Marvin takes another sip of scotch and winces. It's only his third time trying whiskey, and the taste has not grown on him. He looks furtively around the dimly lit bar, hoping not to see anyone from the church. But there's only one other patron at that hour, a man he's never seen before. Guilt curdles in Marvin's veins as he thinks again what Ness would think of him being there. She wouldn't scold him, but the sorrow in her eyes would be so much worse. And he's not finding whatever it is that draws men to such places anyway. There's no comfort for him in the old-fashioned glass, and he's fishing bills from his wallet when the other patron approaches him. The man's smile does not touch his gunmetal eyes. The stranger introduces himself as Hank Metford and offers a cold hand that Marvin shakes politely, and then tries not to shudder at the touch. The notion shoots through Marvin's head that the hand feels like something one might find under a large rock or rotting timber, something slick and translucent that feeds upon carrion and dank decay. With a sly, knowing smile, Hank remarks that Marvin looks a little out of his element, and asks if the wife doesn't let him out much. Bristling slightly, Marvin says that she doesn't tell him what to do. He hates the sound of the words coming out of his mouth, but something about the man is stirring up the shadowy side of himself, the self which he keeps buried. Sure, the man nods and drinks from a bottle of cheap beer. Marvin finishes counting out his tab and the tip, tosses the bills on the counter, and is turning to leave when the man in the fine western shirt places that repellent hand upon his arm. Hank's grip is hard and sharp, talon-like. He says that if Marvin ever needs to feel like himself again, his true self, a man, he should come to him. Hank pulls a small business card from his pocket and thrusts it into Marvin's face, giving him little choice but to take it and jam it into his jeans. Marvin mumbles a word of insincere thanks and hurries out of the bar. When he gets into his car, he cannot resist the urge to wipe his hands on his jeans over and over. Can't help but look in the mirror to make sure his face has not been begrimed. He isn't certain whether it was more the dive bar or the encounter with the strange man that has left him feeling so soiled. Then, despite his abhorrence at the thought of doing so, Marvin draws the business card from his jeans pocket and looks at it. It's plain, white with black lettering, and beneath a simple image of a Winchester repeater reads, "Feel like a man again. Wake the warrior within." His eyes linger on the phone number at the bottom before he shakes his head and rolls down the window, tosses the card out into the bare earth parking lot. Driving home, he tries very hard to erase the number from his mind, but it remains indelible as a hot iron brand. When he walks through the front door and Ness, with a gentle smile, asks him where he's been, the innocent question feels like a subtle rebuke. He says he thinks he'll call the counselor tomorrow, and Ness smiles a little more brightly now and hugs him, tells him that she's proud of him. He has to bite back the bitter words that swell in his throat, makes an effort to return the embrace genuinely. All the while, the cold smile and the gunmetal eyes linger behind his eyelids, like the afterimage of the sun. Standing around the usual gathering place, the men are silent, exchanging brief looks of discomfort. "It's not enough anymore," one of them says. "We need something better, something bigger." Hank nods and raises his free hand placatingly, says that he has a vision, that everything will be all right. They just have to be strong, have to show some balls, and trust him. "We're men," he intones, and grins widely as the others echo his words. For the first time, the expression lights his eyes, and for a moment they seem to glimmer like fire in the failing sunlight. Over breakfast, Marvin tries to calm the jitters crawling around his stomach by reading the local newspaper. He finds a third missing persons article and feels his insides lurch in sudden revolt, feels even sicker when he reads that there are still no leads in the investigation. This is a small community, he thinks, and wonders, where is the fear, the anger, The shock, the outrage. He hasn't even heard whispers of gossip, which borders on impossibility. And he imagines, as he has many times during the insomniac night and all through the morning, standing at the pulpit again and looking out over the assembly in the pews. But this time, the churchgoers do not look like the people he has ministered to for years and known even longer. They look like strangers, with overlarge eyes and open, hungry mouths, filled with teeth that are misshapen and too numerous. He turns the page and reads an article about an atrocity at a school just a few counties over. The coffee turns sour in his stomach, and he runs to the bathroom and spews dark, acidic vomit into the toilet. Then runs cold water and washes his face, brushes his teeth furiously. Looking into the mirror, he thinks that he looks half a corpse. Ness knocks softly upon the door, asks if he's all right. He answers that he isn't feeling too hot, that maybe it's better if he stays home today. Silence answers him. Then, finally, Ness says that if he's sick, she understands. But if he's going to give up his ministry, she really thinks the church should hear it from him directly. Marvin spits into the sink, rinses out his mouth, and agrees flatly. Sometimes he hates her, he thinks, and then reels at the thought. Ness is the best thing that has ever happened to him, has never shown him anything but love and support. Sure, another unbidden thought flashes. As long as you do what she expects. Who wears the pants in this house? Marvin thinks of the number, stares blankly into the mirror, then shakes his head. He really is not right, he tells himself. Nothing sounds better than crawling back into bed and sleeping away the rest of the day. Sleeping forever. He calls to Ness, tells her that he will be ready in just 10 more minutes. But when, later, they are standing before the wide double doors of the white church building, his momentary resolve evaporates again. Ashamed, he murmurs to his wife that he cannot do this. Ness slips her arm under his and softly replies that they will do whatever feels right to him. Marvin knows that she's sincere, and yet cannot quiet the nagging internal voice that says this is a trap, that she despises his weakness. Just then, there is another, less pleasant touch on the opposite shoulder, and Hank whispers into his ear that he will take the pulpit in his place if Marvin can't do it. The words almost seem friendly, but for that particular emphasis he puts on, can't do it. Marvin takes a faltering half-step forward, then freezes again. With a laugh so low, Marvin can't be sure he doesn't only imagine it. Hank pushes past him and climbs the short, wide steps, passes through the open double doors. At last finding the will to move, Marvin follows him in. Ness frowns at his side, confused by the events of the last few moments. Hank is already ascending the dais, and as he takes his place behind the lectern, Marvin leads his wife to a couple of less conspicuous seats at the back. Only sad Lottie and drunken Oz Krum sit so far back and out of sight, avoiding the eyes of the others for their own particular reasons. Despite her obvious confusion, Lottie offers him a smile, while Oz seems as oblivious to his presence as he is to everything else. The general murmur of surprise and perplexity at the appearance of the unfamiliar preacher quickly fades back into silence as Hank raises his arms, lowly at first, then rising in both volume and intensity, and somehow perfectly audible throughout. Hank begins to preach a kind of gospel like none have ever heard within those walls before. A gospel of unconcealed cruelty and of nascent violence. It is the vilest sort of blasphemy, Marvin thinks, and rouses in him a rage born of old loyalty to the faith his private demon has all but swallowed. That awful thing has hounded him sporadically ever since his mid-teens, appearing unbidden and darkening his mind, an inner black hole from which no light escapes, and yet, looking up at the horribly banal prophet behind the open and unheeded Bible upon its lectern, Marvin realizes that this is the first time he's ever seen a true and living demon. Casting his gaze around the church, he sees so many heads bobbing in rapt enthrallment to the wicked, blood-soaked words. Seeing this, Marvin knows he lacks the courage to rise and speak, to stand in opposition to the seduced throng. Then he realizes that Ness has already risen beside him, is now moving up the center aisle. Hank falls silent, and every face turns toward her, her voice quavering with mingled terror and fury. She asks what has happened to this church, to her community. Where, she asks, has the Christian charity and goodwill gone? Hank looks over the crowd and nods. And then Marvin sees Hal Neustrom emerge from a dark recess within the vestibule. In his hand is a short-barreled Colt python, and it seems so much a part of him that at first it doesn't even register how out of place it is in a house of worship and fellowship. And then Hal and another man, a local farmer who has so many times shaken hands and shared smiles with Marvin and his wife, but who now holds a 12-gauge pump shotgun in his hand, are seizing Ness and dragging her back down the aisle and out of the church. Her screams reverberate off the walls, but no one moves to stop the men, or gives any sign of alarm, or even discomfort. After a moment of paralyzed disbelief, Marvin tears himself out of his seat and runs outside after the men, shouting his wife's name. Emerging from the church into the harsh sunlight, he reaches out toward Hal before he feels a terrible lurching sensation, and all goes dark. He comes to in a field, tacky blood staining his forehead. He thinks he recognizes the place as belonging to one of his flock. Then he thinks bitterly that he has no flock, remembering at first that he's given up his vocation, and then suddenly remembering his last conscious moments. Marvin struggles to sit up, but finds his hands cruelly bound with wire. He turns toward a faint whimpering sound on his right, sees his wife lying beside him, similarly bound, and also gagged with a greasy rag. He chokes out an apology to his wife. Then he hears a chuckle above him. Hank shakes his head and clicks his tongue, says that Marvin needs to learn to stop apologizing, that he finally needs to learn how to be a man. He asks if Marvin was listening to his sermon at all, with what seems almost like genuine hurt and disappointment. Almost. As he says this, Neustrom comes forward, holding an item in each hand, his python revolver in the right, a Bible in the left. He holds them forward as another man, one whom Marvin doesn't know, clips the wires around his wrists with a pair of fencing pliers. "Choose," Neustrom says. "Choose," Hank echoes, rubbing the feeling back into his hands, and then wincing at the discomfort of the returning blood flow. Marvin stares dully at the offered items. "Choose," Hank says again, more firmly. Reluctantly, he reaches for the Bible, but then his hand turns toward the revolver. Hank smiles, eyes flashing. Then Neustrom asks what they'll do with the woman, and Hank's expression sours. As he begins to shake his head at Neustrom, Marvin seizes the gun and empties half of the chambers into the man's face. Neustrom slumps forward, falling as heavily and carelessly as a sack of rotten potatoes, his ruined face mashing into the open Bible and turning the thin, white pages to bright red. "Good," Hank says, smiling once more, even as the circle of armed men around them point their assorted firearms at the fallen pastor. "Now," Hank continues, "there's only one thing left to do." He points toward Ness and tells Marvin to cut the last cord that binds him. "No," Marvin mouths. Hank looks at him with those awful eyes, saying nothing further. Then there is a shifting in the bare earth behind Marvin, and he turns to see a thing like a maggot grown into the size and shape of a man, rising out of the ground. As the dirt falls away from the soft, pale flesh, Marvin sees that the thing has no facial features, no fingers, no genitals. Where they should be are only writhing, tentacular appendages, with leech-like maws gaping at the ends. As though it can see despite its lack of eyes, the thing falls upon Neustrom's body, with many small sucking and tearing sounds. Marvin looks away and throws up on a pea plant. His wife, wide-eyed, cannot seem to shift her gaze from the hideous sight. Then Marvin hears the thing shift again, and forces himself to look once more. Rising from the unrecognizable wreckage of what had once been Hal Neustrom, the thing is groping with its many mouths toward Ness. Even as Marvin raises the python, it's falling upon her, the little orifices yawning redly. He fires but a single shot as Hank pushes his hand earthward, the bullet directed not into the abomination as Marvin intended, but into Ness's abdomen. With his iron grasp, Hank pries the pistol away from Marvin and says that this is a necessary sacrifice. Marvin screams his helpless defiance as the thing from beneath gluts itself upon Ness, as her muted whimpers fade into faint groans, and then into silence. Marvin screams until he tastes blood, and his voice is gone, until his sight is veined with black, and he is choking upon the mingled tears and mucus that flood his oronasal passages. After it's finished with her, the demon god of the field turns and slowly, almost gently, moves toward Marvin. Inwardly, Marvin prays to his old and silent deity to let the thing end him too, even if it sends him to hell or to oblivion. But as ever, that god gives no answer, and the pale thing does not feed upon him, only softly touches him with its many mouths, leaving trails of thin pinkish saliva upon his skin. Marvin realizes that it's kissing him. "You're one of us now," Hank says proudly. Marvin only continues to cry loudly, curling into a fetal ball upon the churned earth. Lip twitching, Hank tells him to be a man, that there's much work to be done. Then, as Marvin continues to sob hoarsely, Hank adds that his wife would be ashamed to see him crying like a little girl. "My wife," Marvin says deliberately, grating the words out through his hiccuping, ragged breaths, "is dead." Hank says that he'll find another, a better one, dutiful and obedient. Then, slowly, he offers the revolver once more to Marvin. Against his inner lights, Marvin reaches for it, feels the cold of the nickel finish barrel and the polished wooden grip, and with it, a surging feeling of power. As he rises from the ground, Hank grins and says that they have so much fertile soil to till, so many seeds to plant. He mentions the church, then the local high school, and then the newly opened mart in the next town over. "It's time to spread the word," Hank says. As he turns away, Marvin levelly raises the revolver and points it at the other man's head. Without turning, Hank says softly and with deep satisfaction, a single word: "Excellent." Marvin fires, and the hollow point .357 Magnum round punches through the back of Hank's skull and erupts from his left eye. He falls in a heap, his legs tangled horridly, as Marvin moves leadenly, hollowly, to take Hank's place at the center of the circle. His once brown eyes flash fiery orange, then fade to gunmetal gray. At least, he thinks darkly, this god answers when called. Story, narration, and arrangement by Lars Mollevand. If you enjoyed today's story, please rate, review, and share. Thank you for listening. We'll meet again in darker pastures.